About 3 years ago, I was involved in an internal investigation conducted by my former department regarding a traffic collision I was involved in. My department believed I lied regarding the collision and were trying to spin a narrative that I was attempting to cover the collision up, and additionally, that I was trying to place blame on another officer. So this call for service that the internal investigation stemmed from, I responded to a scene that was in some field with some grass and dirt in it. And as I was driving through the field, preparing to leave the field, I ran over some broken pieces of concrete that I didn't see. I did not realize that my vehicle had been damaged the way that it had been damaged. The vehicle operated fine throughout the rest of my shift, and I continued on through the day. At the time, I worked day shift, and we shared patrol cars with the night shift officers. So at some point in my evening when I was off work, I received a call from a night shift patrol officer whom I shared my patrol car with. He was somewhat panicked. He seemed distressed. He explained he had been through he was in a vehicle pursuit that went through some fields. He passed through bushes and trees. And after the pursuit, he noticed a somewhat large scratch on his vehicle. So he was calling me to ask if I knew where the scratch came from. He wasn't too sure if he had caused the scratch or if I had caused it or if someone else had caused it. And so we had that discussion. I wasn't too sure. At the end of my shift, I didn't do a very thorough end of shift vehicle inspection. And I knew that I hadn't done a very thorough one, so I didn't know if there was a scratch on the car or not. The scratch on this vehicle is located on the front lower bumper on the right side of the vehicle. And we drove Dodge Chargers, which were pretty low to the ground. So naturally, the next morning when I started work, I did a more thorough vehicle inspection, and I also noticed that the front passenger side door was not opening properly. There was some friction when opening the door, and I had no idea what that would have been from, and it wasn't like that the day prior. I called one of my B partners that day that worked on my shift with me and asked him if he could look at the door and figure out why it could be operating that way. So we later met up in a parking lot where officers commonly met up in the city. So as this officer was looking at my car door, I noticed that there was a bolt loose by the wheel. And I showed the officer. He screwed the bolt back in tight. I wasn't too sure what that could have come from. And he just screwed the bolt back in for me. And that was that. So at this point, I wasn't really too sure what happened to the vehicle. I called my sergeant. He was not our regular sergeant. He was just filling in for the day. And let him know there was damage on the vehicle and that I wasn't too sure what had happened. We met at the police station, and he just asked that I tell him everything I knew about the damage. And again, I wasn't too sure, so I told him what I knew, and part of what I knew was what the night shift officer relayed to me, that he'd been in a pursuit the night prior, and he wasn't too sure if he caused damage to the vehicle or not. What is really important here and really important about this conversation is I made sure to emphasize to this sergeant, who is now lieutenant, by the way, that I was not placing blame on another officer. I made sure to explain and use my words very carefully. Was not placing blame for the damage on the night shift officer that drove the vehicle after me. We both just weren't sure where the damage came from. So I explained that to him, and he said he was going to document it. So sometime later, I received a letter from my department that they were conducting an internal affairs investigation regarding this damage to the vehicle. And I was shocked to see when I opened my internal investigation letter that there were a ridiculous amount of policy violations. There was something like 12 policy violations they were accusing me of committing. One of the policy violations to me was egregious. My department was accusing me of essentially throwing another officer under the bus and trying to place blame on another officer for something I did wrong. My department was also accusing me of being dishonest or deceitful about the damage and trying to cover up the damage. So eventually I had my interview, and I went to the interview with my attorney, and my investigators for this internal affairs investigation were a sergeant, and the same sergeant, now lieutenant, that initially asked me about the damage on the vehicle. This sergeant and the other sergeant, who's now lieutenant, had already created an idea and a narrative of what I had done and what my intentions were prior to speaking with me. And it became abundantly clear in this investigation that they did not care what I had to say. They wanted me to agree with what they were saying, and they didn't want to hear what I had to say. It almost seemed as though it was making them angry to hear what I had to say, even though what I had to say was the truth. What they were telling me in this investigation about myself, what they were telling me what I did and what my intentions were not true and were not accurate. So of course I defended that. I told them what I did and what my intentions were. But that made them so upset. That made them so angry. And it got to a point where my attorney made us stop. She made us stop through the interview and wanted me to step out with her. And we had a discussion about it. She was pretty shocked with how they were acting towards me. And pretty confused as to why they were so hell-bent that my intentions were so bad when they were not. As I mentioned in this investigation, they were alluding that I was attempting to place blame on another officer for a mistake that I made. This is really significant because one of my investigators was the sergeant, now lieutenant, that I initially spoke with about the damage to the vehicle. I had a conversation with this sergeant, now lieutenant, and took the time to tell him and explain to him that I was not trying to place blame on anyone else or say that anyone else was responsible. I simply did not know all the details, and I gave him the information I knew while still being very careful to emphasize I'm not blaming this on anyone else. He took that information I gave him, he took that conversation, and he twisted it, and he threw it back in my face and used it against me in an internal investigation.